Session of our second Royal Psalm, Psalm 18. Today we're going to take a look at steps C and C prime of the chiastic structure of our Psalm 18. Step C is titled Yahweh Comes. He's coming, of course, to deal with the king's affliction. That was spoken of in part B, step B. Step C prime on the way out is called the victorious king. So let's take our now usual approach and check a PowerPoint display. Well, here we are, the chiasm for Psalm 18. We're going to take a look at it in remembrance that it was a 9-step psalm, starting with the Rock of Israel at step A. At the center message, the main message is E, the faithful God, stepping back away from that message to A prime, God, the Rock of Israel. You remember a couple sessions ago, we began with step E, the faithful God, discovering the main message of the psalm was the faithfulness of the king to his God and the faithfulness of his God to himself. So that's where we were with the main message. Then we stepped and added in D and D prime, steps D and D prime, where we spoke about Yahweh delivering. He's delivering from the afflictions the king was facing, his difficulty, his hard times, his hard places. And we then spoke to remember the faithful God message in the center. And then on the way out, we saw the king's attributes glorifying God. It was the king's glorification of God's attributes, not his own, of course. So there we are. That's where we have been. That's where we will go next to add in C and step C prime, starting to fill out this chiastic structure a bit. C, Yahweh comes in response to the king's prayer about his hard place. And in C prime, the king's statements exalting God for the victories that the king experienced over his enemies in his hard places. So that's where we are. That's where we are going. After the king describes his affliction in step B, which we'll look at next time, the affliction was perhaps caused by a political foe trying to dethrone the king. You know, David's one of his sons tried to depose him. A personal foe that's attempting to kill him. That was true of Saul, who was David didn't think he was his foe, but he found out otherwise. A powerful enemy surrounding him in battle. Some form of debilitating sickness, disease, or weakness. The king pictures Yahweh's coming after he describes whatever his affliction was. And as I said, we'll take a look at that next time. So, to check God's reaction to the predicament of the king, that's what we want to do now. The king has just told God about his problems, the hard times, the hard place he's in, and here is the Lord's response. This is starting in verse 7, going through verse 15. Then the earth shook and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains were trembling and were shaken, because he, that's Yahweh, was angry when he found out, or when the king evidently informed God as if he didn't know anyhow. But when God is aware of it, he became angry. You see all those disturbances in creation that signal his anger. Verse 8, smoke went out from his nostrils, and fire from his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. So he's hot. He, God, bowed the heavens also, and came down with thick darkness under his feet. And that's signaling again his anger. And he rode upon a cherub and flew. He sped upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his hiding place, his canopy around him, darkness of waters, thick clouds of the skies. From the brightness before him, notice it changes when you get in God's presence. From the brightness before him passed his thick clouds, hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. That's a scary time, is it not? Let's continue. Verse 14, and Yahweh sent out his arrows and scattered them, and lightning flashes in abundance, and routed them. That would be whoever the enemy is, of course. Then the channels of water appeared, and the foundations of the world were laid bare. There's no place to hide. At thy rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils. Remember, the breath of God's nostrils also provide life. Now, this earth shaking, maybe earthquakes, who knows, I don't. Earth shaking tells of God's anger at the predicament of his king. He feels the same way, by the way, toward any of his elect. Fire and smoke of his, speak of his readiness to act on behalf of his chosen one, in this case the king. He swoops down, God swoops down quickly to rescue his own people. He does not come quietly. He signals his arrival and his intent. There's no hiding place for the opposition, not even in the depths of the sea or any other waters for that matter. Make no mistake, God cares about his people and is sensitive to their situation. That's what we're seeing. The minute the king described his hard place, God showed his response. There's no doubt as to Yahweh's power and authority. When you look at that passage, you know what's going on. What the psalmist has described is actually a theophany. It's an appearance or the presence of Yahweh, the presence of God couched in the anthropomorphic language of man. Hard word to say, right? We use human terms to describe what we cannot describe. And here the king is trying to describe God's anger, his vengeance, his attack, his presence. And by the way, this is not unusual. Cataclysmic events were often used to describe the presence of God in the Old Testament. Here God comes in angry at the situation his king finds himself in, and he plans to do something about it. The picture that we are given there and painted by the psalmist is one of sheer power. Habakkuk chapter 3 gives an even more extensive picture of the presence of God in power to rescue his people. It's worth reading, by the way. Chapter 3 of the minor prophet Habakkuk. Habakkuk had a complaint against God. He said, God, I know about you, and what I see I can't reconcile to you. God says, well, I'm going to show you. You're not going to like the picture, but I'll show it to you. So let's check another narrative, one from the wilderness wanderings, and we see a lot of the same kind of evidence of the presence of God. I'm reading now from Exodus 19, beginning in verse 16. I'll read through verse 20. So it came about on the third day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes, sound familiar, and a thick cloud upon the mountain, that would be Mount Sinai, and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Those would be the Israelites, of course. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. And they stood at the foot of the mountain, again, Mount Sinai. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. So there's the presence of the Lord being shown by a cataclysmic creation response. Verse 19, when the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. And verse 20, and the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. If you think that such events are over, by the way, if you think such events are over, you ought to read Revelation chapter 19. You think it can't happen again? Now, as we saw in our last session, Yahweh had delivered the king from his affliction. That's found in verses 16 through 19. The Lord is now indignant at the king's trouble. The Lord has no fear, or the king has no fear, for when God comes, God will come in his love for the king in order to rescue him. And God will take him out of the hard place, move him to a broad place of security. The king described his relationship with God in verses 20 through 29. We saw that a couple times ago. This is the central message. The king walks uprightly, he says, with a heart right with Yahweh, and God responds to him in faithfulness. And the king praised God's attributes, and he acted on his behalf. When God acted on his behalf, the king praised his attributes and those actions. God's ways are perfect. His word is flawless. He shields and protects his own. God, the only God, absolutely the only God, is also absolutely good. And now the king goes on to describe his victory over that affliction, whatever it was, with Yahweh's help. And we're jumping now to verse 37 of Psalm 18. And the king writes, watch this, this is now, he's going after his enemy. I pursued my enemies and overtook them. I did not turn back until they were consumed. I shattered them so that they were not able to rise. They fell under my feet. For thou, O God, hast girded me with strength for battle. He's now giving Yahweh the credit for this victory that he is taking part in, or leading, or actually doing himself. Thou hast subdued under me those who rose up against me. And You made it possible for me to take care of my enemies. Thou also hast made my enemies to turn their backs to me. They're on the run. And I destroyed those who hated me. They cried for help, but there was none to save. They even cried to the Lord, but he didn't answer them. They're not going to turn the tables on me and get my God against me. Verse 42, then I beat them fine as the dust before the wind. I emptied them out as the mire of the streets. There's that parallelism again. I beat them fine as the dust in the road. I emptied them out as the mire of the streets. The king was empowered and emboldened. Why? Not because of something he said, but because of Yahweh's appearance. And because of Yahweh's appearance, the king became a mighty warrior. The enemy couldn't stand alone, let alone prevail. The enemy had no help available from any source. Their destruction was total. So what has the psalmist told you and me in the midst of this? No enemy of God can defeat us, the elect, when we are God's anointed. Don't sweat it. His advice, don't be overly preoccupied with your troubles. Call on the Lord for help, for empowerment, and for victory. Now, let me give you a quick closing PowerPoint recording. By way of review, this is where we just finished up with C, D, E, D prime, and C prime. Next time we will add B and B prime. We'll look at the king's affliction as he described it in verses 4 through 6, and we'll see his remembrance of the deliverance from those afflictions in 43 through 45. Well, there you have it. Until the next session then, and recall again, God has come to the rescue. We should be able to bank on that ourselves if, in fact, we are believers in Jesus our Christ. So until next session then, hang in there. We'll get on with B and B prime, as we said a moment ago. We'll see.